Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, and today's video is going to be about Moschino. And I recently read a book about Moschino as a brand, especially within like the 80s and 90s, and also kind of discovering some very interesting things about Franco Moschino, his design approaches and how he would approach design and what his intentions were behind certain types of clothing. I felt like, especially with this brand in general, I would always sort of like see it around, especially within sort of like the fashion space, and also seeing different types of celebrities wearing this brand as well. I think it's very important to sort of understand brand history, especially with like Moschino's style in general. There's a lot of like creative and artistic elements within his design, especially with certain types of designs that he's made. They can be quite very much unorthodox, and it can provide this sense of thought, which I feel like as well within fashion that can be a very important thing to do as well, because I think sometimes it's not just always about nice clothing all the time. I think sometimes communicating a certain message to the viewers or to the people who are very much immersed into the fashion world, I think that can be very important as well, which can help to create these deeper discussions about what's happening in the world as well. So with this being said, having like this intellectual position within fashion, especially sort of this very dramatic design, like something that's very like theatrical, so drawing inspirations from classical theater from the 1700s, especially down to certain types of detailing like crochet, especially like within his approaches. It was like this idea of destroying the myth that fashion must be sort of original in a sense. Also within his designs and the way things would be presented, it would be very much fun, and this sort of like freedom of having fun, creativity, and also providing that sense of humor within fashion shows as well. Something that is not rigid and something that nearly like an everyday person can connect with through this very like interesting interpretation of what fashion means to Moschino. And especially within the 90s, in the book that I was reading, it does mention like this idea of like the fashion shows being equivalent to performance, and also just tying back to this idea of having this freedom of expression and providing a sense of humor within the fashion shows, but also through the design as well, which I think is very interesting as well, because I think the sense of how fashion can be seen sort of like this very serious, rigid sort of approach to things, and everything needs to be conveyed in a certain type of light. So sort of taking a different type of direction, especially within the clothes and how things are communicated, the fabrics, and all the way up to like the fashion shows and displaying these different types of things. I think it's very interesting that I kind of wanted to have like a different type of take to that, especially with a Moschino. But I noticed as well, that there was this sense of like designing things in a way where there isn't like sort of set seasons or like collections within the clothes that he was creating, and all of like these different types of clothing. And I think from my perspective on this, I think this is a very sort of good idea, because I think sometimes if you're trying to design around a season, sometimes it ends up becoming a lot more rigid, and there's constraints within that, because you're now having to tailor it to this idea of being very much aware about the weather, the climate, and what type of fabrics can work well within that climate as well. So I thought that was very sort of interesting, that of course there are sense of like collections, but solely designing for a season can sort of like limit that sort of freedom of expression. And I remember seeing this a lot, especially with like Love Moschino as well, sort of like that sort of branch off brand from the main brand itself. I'm seeing this use of the heart. This sort of became like kind of iconic for the brand itself. The new persona, new universe project, and it was basically sort of like an installation of a heart, but it was a maze. So it was basically like a maze hut that was basically constructed, and it was again meant to sort of represent causes, the observations, but also how hut is sort of seen as, again, like sort of the main function of everything, which I thought was a very interesting take. And eventually, of course, the heart was now seen as like icon from the brand, and I've seen this throughout like different type of collections, but also in their clothing in general. So I really do like there was some sort of intention and meaning behind that, instead of something just being used because it looks aesthetic. And I want to mention before, especially with like Moschino's like culture designs, especially displaying them within like exhibitions and installations and stuff like that. This was used in like an expedition, and this was in 1988. And with this idea, he used like basically a plain white t-shirt to sort of replace canvas, and in a way he was doing this to sort of like poke fun at like the stiff ideas of establishment. And I think that's sort of like a very interesting take, especially like amongst fashion as well. But again, I feel like that there's not any essence of like humor and having fun, not having fun with design, so then it's sort of like presented in this very sort of like plain state. I think that's sort of like what that white t-shirt is sort of symbolizing in a way, sort of like these weird stiff ideas. But that was sort of like my take, my perspective, especially with the slogans which were used. They were transformed into clothing, and that clothing can be again used as a form of communication of the person who's wearing those items, personality or viewpoint, or sort of like their just standpoint in general when it comes to these certain phrases. Like I said before, to be or not to be, that's fashion, or like you can't judge a girl on the clothes that she wears. Just very interesting statements, can be interpreted very differently. Encouraging this type of conversation through clothing and communicating and doing it very well. So I thought this was very interesting, especially with the way that Moschino at the time, especially like around the 80s and 90s, the way that he would approach design and the intention behind it, and also not falling into the constraints of fashion being original and sterilized, and creating that sort of like sense of humor and having fun with design as well, but also still communicating certain issues in a very smart and clever way. So I thought that was very interesting within that, because I've always seen Moschino as like a very sort of unorthodox brand in a way, and especially the way that they would display their designs and again like their fashion shows and stuff like that, something that is more sort of like a performance. So I think it was very interesting to just look into that, especially during that time as well. This is the end of the video. I hope you guys enjoyed watching this video. Make sure you like, comment, share and subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next video.